The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Admiral Richardson leaned forward across the polished mahogany table, his weathered hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the young woman sitting opposite him. Around them, the Pentagon's most senior officers held their breath. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, his voice was steady but curious. In your 4 years of active combat duty, how many enemy combatants have you eliminated? The room fell silent. This wasn't unusual. Kill counts were part of military assessments, part of understanding a soldier's experience and psychological state. What happened next, however, would become legend in military circles and challenge everything they thought they knew about courage, humanity, and what it truly means to serve. Sarah looked up from her hands, met the Admiral's gaze directly, and said 7 words that would echo through the halls of the Pentagon for years to come. 7 words that would redefine how the military viewed its most decorated female sniper. 7 words that revealed a truth so profound, it would change military protocol forever. But to understand the weight of those words, you need to know Sarah's story. You need to understand the journey that brought a small-town girl from Oregon to become one of the most effective and controversial soldiers in modern military history. You need to know what she witnessed, what she endured, and what she discovered about herself in the crucible of war. This is that story. This is the account of how a quiet librarian's daughter became a lethal weapon, and how her answer to one simple question would shake the very foundations of military thinking. The truth, as Sarah would learn, is rarely what it appears to be. Sarah Chun had never planned to kill anyone. Growing up in the quiet town of Bend, Oregon, her biggest concerns were late library books and whether she'd have enough money for college. Her parents, David and Ming Chun, ran a small bookstore downtown, the kind of place where locals gathered on rainy afternoons to discuss everything from local politics to the latest bestsellers. Sarah spent most of her teenage years there, nose buried in novels, helping customers find their next great read. The bookstore was struggling. Online retailers were killing small businesses across America, and the Chun family was no exception. By Sarah's senior year of high school, the writing was on the wall. College seemed like an impossible dream. Her grades were excellent, her SAT scores impressive, but the family simply didn't have the money. Financial aid would help, but not enough. That's when Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez walked into their bookstore one Tuesday afternoon in March. She wasn't there for books. The Army had set up a small recruitment station in the strip mall next door, and Maria needed somewhere quiet to make phone calls between appointments. Sarah's mother, always generous with struggling neighbors, offered her coffee and a corner table. "You're Sarah, right?" Maria said during her 3rd visit. "Your mom mentioned you're thinking about college." Sarah nodded, not looking up from her chemistry textbook. She was studying for finals, though the pressure felt overwhelming. Even if she aced everything, college still seemed financially out of reach. "Have you considered the military?" Maria asked gently. "Full tuition, housing allowance, and you get to serve your country." Sarah's first reaction was to laugh. Her in the military? She was 5'4", preferred books to sports, and had never so much as thrown a punch. The idea seemed absurd. "I know what you're thinking," Maria continued. "But the military isn't just about combat. We need medics, communication specialists, logistics coordinators, people who can think critically, solve problems. People like you." Over the next few weeks, Maria became a regular at the bookstore. She wasn't pushy, never pressured Sarah to decide quickly. Instead, she shared stories about her own journey. How the military had given her direction when she felt lost. How it had paid for her education and provided skills she never knew she possessed. How it had shown her parts of the world she'd only read about in books. Sarah's parents were hesitant, but supportive. They understood the financial reality their daughter faced. The military could provide opportunities their struggling bookstore never could. After months of consideration, research, and family discussions, Sarah made her decision. She enlisted as a combat medic specialist with a college fund attachment. The plan was simple: serve 4 years, save money, use her medical training and GI Bill to become a nurse or physician's assistant. It seemed like a practical path toward a stable future. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The physical demands pushed her beyond what she thought possible. The mental challenges tested her problem-solving abilities in ways her small-town high school never had. But it was the weapons training that surprised her most. Sarah discovered she had an unusual talent for marksmanship. During rifle qualification, while other recruits struggled to hit targets at 300 meters, Sarah consistently scored expert ratings. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, her focus laser-sharp. Instructors began to notice. "Chun," Drill Sergeant Patterson called after one particularly impressive shooting session. "You ever consider specialized training?" Sarah shook her head. She was there to be a medic, to help people, not to become more proficient at weapons. "Think about it," Patterson said. "The military needs people who can protect medics, protect convoys, protect forward operating bases. Your skills could save a lot of lives." The idea planted a seed. Sarah began to research different military occupational specialties. She learned about combat medics who also served as designated marksmen, providing both medical support and protective overwatch for their units. It seemed like a way to combine her desire to help people with her unexpected talent for shooting. After completing advanced individual training as a medic, Sarah volunteered for additional marksmanship training. The instructors were initially skeptical. Female snipers were rare, and many questioned whether she had the psychological makeup for the role. But Sarah's scores spoke for themselves. She excelled in every aspect of sniper training. Her small stature was actually an advantage for concealment. Her steady hands, developed through years of careful library work, translated perfectly to precision shooting. Most importantly, her analytical mind, trained through years of reading and study, proved excellent at calculating distances, wind effects, and environmental factors. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, her primary instructor, was impressed but cautious. "Shooting paper targets is different from shooting at people," he warned during one of their sessions. "You can be the best marksman in the world, but if you can't pull the trigger when it matters, you're useless in combat." Sarah understood his concern, but she felt confident in her abilities and her commitment to protecting her fellow soldiers. What she didn't understand yet was how complicated those feelings would become when faced with actual combat situations. Her first deployment came sooner than expected. Tensions were escalating in Eastern Europe, and specialized units were being deployed to support NATO allies. Sarah found herself assigned to a forward medical support team, tasked with providing both medical aid and precision fire support for patrol operations. The countryside was beautiful in a way that reminded her of Oregon. Rolling hills, dense forests, small villages where life seemed to move at a slower pace. It was easy to forget, during quiet moments, that they were in an active conflict zone. That illusion shattered during her first week in country. The patrol had been routine, a simple reconnaissance mission to check on a remote observation post. Sarah was positioned on a hillside, providing overwatch while medics attended to a soldier who had twisted his ankle during the hike. Through her scope, she watched the peaceful valley below, scanning for any signs of hostile activity. Movement caught her eye. 3 figures in military-style clothing, carrying weapons, moving toward the observation post from an unexpected direction. They weren't friendly forces. The patrol leader had confirmed no other allied units were operating in that area. "Contact, 3 individuals approaching from the southeast," Sarah reported through her radio. "Armed and moving with tactical formation." The patrol leader's voice crackled back. "Rules of engagement are in effect. You are cleared to engage if they pose an imminent threat to friendly forces." Sarah watched through her scope as the 3 figures continued their approach. They were clearly hostile, their movements deliberate and coordinated. Through her magnified optic, she could see details that chilled her. Improvised explosive devices attached to their equipment, automatic weapons, faces covered by masks. One of them raised his rifle, aiming toward the observation post where 2 American soldiers were stationed. Sarah's training took over. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate steadied, her finger found the trigger. The crosshairs settled on the lead figure, the one preparing to fire on her fellow soldiers. She pulled the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the valley. Through her scope, she watched the hostile figure drop. The other 2 immediately took cover, looking around frantically for the source of the shot. "One down," Sarah reported, her voice remarkably steady. 2 remaining, taking cover behind the stone wall. What followed was a brief but intense firefight. The remaining hostile forces attempted to flank the observation post, but Sarah's elevated position gave her clear fields of fire. Within minutes, the threat was eliminated. As the dust settled and friendly forces secured the area, Sarah remained in her overwatch position, processing what had just happened. She had killed 3 people. 3 human beings who, moments before, had been breathing, thinking, planning. Now they lay still in the peaceful valley that reminded her so much of home. The patrol leader's voice brought her back to the present. "Outstanding work, Chun. You saved American lives today." But Sarah wasn't thinking about the lives she had saved. She was thinking about the faces she had seen through her scope in those final moments. Young faces, not much older than herself. People who had mothers and fathers, maybe siblings, maybe dreams of their own. That night, back at the forward operating base, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, staring at her rifle. The weapon that had been an extension of herself during training now felt foreign, heavy with new meaning. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Medical training had taught her to save lives. Now she was taking them. The contradiction felt overwhelming. Chaplain Williams found her there hours later, still sitting in the dark. "Heard about today," he said gently, sitting down across from her. "Want to talk about it?" Sarah looked up at him. This kind man who had probably had this conversation with countless soldiers. "They were so young," she whispered. "Through the scope, I could see their faces clearly. One of them couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. But they were armed," the chaplain reminded her. "They were about to kill American soldiers. You did your job." "I know," Sarah said. "I know I did the right thing. I know I saved lives. But that doesn't make it easier." The chaplain nodded understanding. "The weight you're feeling, that's what separates us from the enemy. That's what makes you human. Don't try to push it away. Honor it. Learn from it. But don't let it paralyze you." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into her duties with renewed focus. She studied every aspect of her role, from advanced medical procedures to ballistics calculations. She wanted to be perfect, to ensure that every shot she took was absolutely necessary and absolutely precise. Her reputation began to grow within the unit. Other soldiers requested her specifically for dangerous missions. Command began assigning her to increasingly complex operations. Her combination of medical skills and marksmanship made her invaluable for small unit operations in contested areas. But with each successful mission, each confirmed elimination, Sarah felt herself changing. The weight the chaplain had described was accumulating, pressing down on her with increasing force. She began keeping a private journal, trying to process the moral complexity of her situation. Day 47, she wrote one evening. "Eliminated 2 hostile forces today during convoy protection. Clean shots, immediate threats neutralized. Convoy proceeded safely to destination. No friendly casualties. Mission successful by every metric. So why do I feel like I'm losing pieces of myself?" The answer would come to her gradually, through experiences that would challenge everything she thought she knew about war, about duty, and about the true cost of violence. As her first deployment neared its end, Sarah had compiled a record that impressed her superiors and concerned her personally. 14 confirmed eliminations, 0 friendly casualties in operations she supported, commendations for valor and professionalism. On paper, she was a perfect soldier. In reality, she was struggling with questions that had no easy answers. Questions that would eventually lead her to give an answer that shocked an admiral and changed military thinking forever. But that revelation was still months and many difficult experiences away. For now, Sarah was simply a young soldier trying to reconcile her desire to help people with the violent reality of her job, unaware that her internal struggle would eventually produce insights that would revolutionize how the military understood the psychological impact of combat on its most effective warriors. Sarah's leave between deployments lasted 30 days, but it felt like a lifetime. Returning to Bend, Oregon, she found herself caught between 2 worlds. Her childhood bedroom looked exactly the same, but she felt like a completely different person occupying it. The bookstore still smelled of coffee and old paper. Her parents still moved through their routines with gentle predictability, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was viewing it all through bulletproof glass. "You seem different," her mother said one evening as they closed the store together. "Quieter. More serious." Sarah wanted to explain, but how could she describe the weight of taking human lives to someone whose biggest moral dilemma was whether to charge late fees? How could she share the nightmares, the way she automatically scanned rooftops and doorways everywhere she went, the way her hand instinctively moved toward her hip where her sidearm should be? Instead, she simply said, "The military changes you, makes you grow up fast." Her father, always perceptive, seemed to understand what she couldn't say. He didn't push for details about her deployment, didn't ask about the medals that had arrived in official packages. He simply made sure she knew she was welcome home, whatever she had experienced overseas. The nightmares were the worst part. Sarah would dream of faces in her scope, of that split second between acquiring a target and pulling the trigger. She would wake up with her heart racing, hands shaking, the taste of adrenaline bitter in her mouth. Sleep became elusive, and when it did come, it offered no rest. During her final week of leave, Sarah visited the Veterans Affairs office in nearby Portland. She needed to talk to someone who would understand, someone who had walked a similar path. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a clinical psychologist who specialized in combat trauma. She had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Navy psychiatrist before transitioning to civilian practice. When Sarah walked into her office, Dr. Walsh immediately recognized something familiar in the young woman's posture and demeanor. "Tell me about your experience," Dr. Walsh said after the initial paperwork was complete. Sarah found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She talked about the disconnect between her original motivation to help people and the reality of her combat role. She described the technical aspects of long-range shooting, the mathematics and physics that made her so effective. Most importantly, she talked about the faces. "Every target has a face," Sarah explained. "Through a high-powered scope, they're not abstract enemies. They're individuals. Young men mostly. Some of them look scared. Some look determined. All of them look human." Dr. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "How do you process the humanity while still performing your mission?" "I don't know if I do," Sarah admitted. "I complete the mission because people's lives depend on it. American lives. My friends, my fellow soldiers. But afterwards, when things are quiet, I think about the families those men won't return to. The mothers who will wonder what happened to their sons. That empathy, that moral awareness, it's not a weakness," Dr. Walsh said. "In fact, it might be what makes you so effective. Soldiers who dehumanize the enemy often become reckless, imprecise. Your humanity keeps you careful, keeps you accurate." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Dr. Walsh helped Sarah understand that her psychological response was normal, even healthy. The absence of such feelings would be more concerning than their presence. She taught Sarah coping strategies, ways to process the moral complexity of her role without becoming paralyzed by it. "War is never morally simple," Dr. Walsh concluded. "Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or hasn't seen real combat. The fact that you're struggling with these questions tells me you're exactly the kind of person who should be carrying that rifle." Sarah left the session feeling lighter, but also more aware of the challenges ahead. She was scheduled to redeploy in 6 months, this time to a more active combat zone. The break had given her time to process her first deployment, but she knew greater tests were coming. Her second deployment took her to a mountainous region where insurgent activity had increased dramatically. The terrain was harsh, the weather unpredictable, and the enemy more sophisticated than anything she had encountered before. Sarah was assigned to an elite reconnaissance team tasked with gathering intelligence and disrupting enemy supply lines. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson led the team, and he quickly recognized Sarah's unique value. Her medical training made her invaluable for long-duration missions where evacuation wasn't possible. Her marksmanship skills provided security for operations deep in hostile territory. Most importantly, her analytical mind helped the team solve complex tactical problems. "Chun," Thompson said during their first mission briefing, "you're not just our medic or our sniper. You're our insurance policy. When everything goes wrong, you're the one who keeps us alive." The responsibility felt enormous, but Sarah had grown into it. Months of training and real-world experience had transformed her from an uncertain young recruit into a confident professional. She understood her capabilities and trusted her judgment in ways that would have been impossible a year earlier. Their first major operation involved infiltrating a remote valley where intelligence suggested a high-value target was planning a significant attack on coalition forces. The mission required a 5-day insertion, moving through territory controlled by hostile forces, gathering information, and potentially eliminating specific threats. Sarah found herself carrying more equipment than ever before: medical supplies for treating wounded teammates, specialized ammunition for different scenarios, communications gear for calling in support or extraction. The physical demands were extreme, but her body had adapted to military life. What had once seemed impossible now felt routine. The team moved through the mountains like ghosts, avoiding enemy patrols, gathering intelligence, slowly working toward their objective. Sarah's role evolved beyond predetermined parameters. Her steady hands made her the natural choice for delicate equipment repairs. Her medical knowledge helped the team avoid areas where disease or contamination might pose risks. Her shooting skills provided confidence during dangerous boundary crossings. On the 3rd day, they encountered their first serious challenge. An enemy patrol stumbled onto their position during a rest period. The contact was immediate and violent. Sarah found herself in a life-or-death situation unlike anything in her previous deployment. The enemy was close, well-trained, and determined. Through her scope, she could see individual details that made the situation intensely personal. a young fighter wearing a wedding ring, another clutching a photograph as he took cover, an older man who might have been someone's father or grandfather. But she could also see her teammates pinned down by enemy fire, wounded, and calling for help. The moral equation was clear, even if emotionally complex. Sarah's shots were precise and decisive. Each trigger pull eliminated a specific threat to her team's survival. Within minutes, the contact was resolved. But this time, the aftermath was different. As the team secured the area and treated wounds, Sarah found one of the enemy fighters still alive, but critically injured. Her medical training kicked in automatically. Despite the man being an enemy combatant who had just tried to kill her teammates, she found herself working to save his life. "Chen, what are you doing?" Thompson asked, approaching cautiously. "He's dying," Sarah replied, applying pressure to an arterial bleed. "I can keep him alive long enough for evacuation." "He just tried to kill us," another team member pointed out. "I know," Sarah said, not looking up from her medical work. "But he's not trying to kill us now. He's just dying." The wounded fighter looked up at her with confused, pain-filled eyes. He said something in his native language that Sarah didn't understand, but his tone was clear. He was asking why she was helping him. Sarah continued working, using advanced medical techniques to stabilize wounds she had created with her rifle. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become a perfect instrument of both death and life, capable of taking lives with surgical precision and saving them with equal skill. The man survived long enough for medical evacuation. Whether he ultimately lived or died, Sarah never learned. But the incident changed something fundamental in her understanding of war and her role in it. That evening, as the team established a new position, Thompson approached Sarah during her watch. "What you did today," he said quietly. "Not everyone would have made that choice." Sarah continued scanning the valley below through her scope. He was a human being in pain. That's all that mattered in that moment. "Even after he tried to kill us?" "Especially then," Sarah replied. "If I stop seeing enemies as human beings, I become something I don't want to be." Thompson was quiet for a long moment. "You know what that makes you?" "What?" "Dangerous," he said. "The most dangerous kind of soldier. One who can kill when necessary but never loses sight of the cost." The mission continued for 2 more days. Sarah accumulated 3 more confirmed eliminations, each one precise, necessary, and personally devastating. She also saved the life of a teammate who stepped on an improvised explosive device, performing field surgery under fire that military doctors later called miraculous. By the time they extracted, Sarah had cemented her reputation as something unique, a warrior healer who could take life or save it with equal proficiency, depending on what the situation required. But the psychological toll was accumulating. Each face in her scope became part of a growing gallery in her mind. Each life saved balanced against each life taken in a complex moral accounting that kept her awake at night. Her commanding officers began recommending her for increasingly sensitive missions. Her combination of skills made her invaluable for operations that required both combat effectiveness and moral judgment. She became the soldier commanders requested when they needed someone who could make split-second life and death decisions under extreme pressure. Over the course of her second deployment, Sarah participated in 17 major operations. Her confirmed elimination count rose to 38. She had also provided life-saving medical treatment to 43 wounded soldiers and 6 enemy combatants. The statistics painted a picture of a perfect soldier, someone who embodied the military's highest ideals. But Sarah knew the numbers told only part of the story. Behind each statistic was a human face, a moment of decision that carried moral weight far beyond any official recognition. As her second deployment neared its end, Sarah found herself changed in ways that went beyond professional competence. She had become someone comfortable with ultimate responsibility, someone who could make decisions that others couldn't or wouldn't make. But she had also become someone who understood the true cost of violence in ways that most people never would. Her final operation of the deployment involved rescuing a captured pilot from a heavily defended compound. Sarah's role was to provide precision fire support while Special Operations Forces conducted the actual rescue. The mission required her to eliminate sentries and guards with surgical accuracy, clearing a path for the rescue team. Everything went according to plan until the extraction. As the rescue team emerged with the captured pilot, they came under heavy fire from a previously unknown position. Sarah could see the muzzle flashes in the darkness, could calculate the angle and distance needed to neutralize the threat. But through her night vision scope, she could also see something else, a child in the building where the hostile fire was originating. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, caught in a war zone through no choice of her own. Sarah had a clear shot at the enemy position. She could eliminate the threat and ensure the rescue team's safe extraction. But any missed shot, any fragment or ricochet, could harm an innocent child. For several seconds that felt like hours, Sarah wrestled with the decision. The rescue team was pinned down. The captured pilot needed immediate medical attention. Every moment of delay increased the risk to American lives. But the child's face through her scope reminded her why she had become a medic in the first place: to protect innocence, to preserve life, to do no harm. Sarah made a choice that would later become legendary in special operations circles. Instead of taking the shot, she called in precise coordinates for a flashbang grenade. The non-lethal explosive would disorient the enemy fighters without risking harm to the child. The tactic worked. The enemy fire ceased temporarily, allowing the rescue team to extract safely. But it had required Sarah to reject the simple solution in favor of a more complex and risky approach. Later, during the mission debrief, her commanding officer questioned the decision. "You had a clear shot," Colonel Martinez said. "Why didn't you take it?" "There was a child in the structure," Sarah replied simply. "I found another way." "What if that other way hadn't worked?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Then, I would have taken the shot. But I had to try the alternative first." The colonel studied her for a long moment. "You understand that your primary responsibility is to American forces?" "Yes, sir. And I fulfilled that responsibility. Everyone came home alive, including the enemy fighters." "Including everyone," Sarah said firmly. That conversation marked a turning point in how senior officers viewed Sarah Chun. She had demonstrated not just technical proficiency, but moral courage and tactical innovation under extreme pressure. She had proven that ethical considerations could enhance rather than compromise military effectiveness. As she prepared to return home for leave before her third deployment, Sarah carried with her a record of accomplishment that was unprecedented for someone her age and experience. But, more importantly, she carried with her a developing philosophy about war, violence, and the responsibilities that came with lethal authority. The questions that had troubled her during her first deployment had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of moral complexity in combat situations. She had learned to live with contradictions, to accept that sometimes the right choice involved taking a life, and sometimes it involved risking American lives to preserve enemy ones. These lessons would prove crucial during her third deployment, when she would face situations that would test everything she had learned about herself and her role as a soldier. The young woman who returned to Oregon was no longer the uncertain recruit who had left 2 years earlier. She had become something much more dangerous and much more valuable, a warrior with a conscience who had learned to trust both her skills and her judgment in equal measure. Sarah's third deployment began with a promotion and an assignment that would test everything she had learned about war, morality, and herself. She was now Sergeant Chun, a reconnaissance team leader responsible not just for her own actions, but for guiding younger soldiers through the same moral complexity she had been navigating for 2 years. The theater of operations was different this time, an urban environment where insurgents had taken control of several city districts. The mission was counterinsurgency, working with local forces to restore government control while minimizing civilian casualties. It was the most politically sensitive and morally complex assignment of Sarah's military career. Her team consisted of 4 other soldiers, all of whom were on their first or second deployments. Private Rodriguez, barely 19 years old, reminded Sarah of herself when she first deployed, eager, capable, but unprepared for the psychological realities of combat. Corporal Jackson had one previous deployment but had never seen serious action. Specialist Williams was experienced but had requested transfer to Sarah's team specifically because of her reputation for bringing everyone home alive. "Listen up," Sarah told her team during their first briefing in country. "We're not just here to complete missions. We're here to do it right. That means every shot we take is justified, every decision we make considers long-term consequences, and every action reflects the values we're supposed to be defending." The young soldiers nodded, but Sarah could see in their eyes that they didn't fully understand what she meant. They would learn, just as she had learned, through experiences that would change them forever. Their first operation involved clearing a residential district where insurgents had established sniper positions in civilian buildings. Traditional military doctrine would call for artillery strikes or air support to neutralize the threat. But such tactics would inevitably result in significant civilian casualties. Sarah proposed a different approach. Her team would systematically identify sniper positions through reconnaissance, then neutralize them with precision fire during predetermined time windows when civilians were least likely to be present. That's going to take weeks instead of days, Major Harrison pointed out during the planning session. Yes, sir, Sarah agreed. But it will also mean we don't have to write reports explaining why we killed families while they were sleeping. The major studied her for a moment. Sarah had developed a reputation for challenging conventional tactics when she believed there were better alternatives. Usually, her methods proved more effective in the long run. Approved, he said finally. But you're responsible for the timeline. If this operation drags on too long, we'll have to consider more direct approaches. Sarah's team spent 3 weeks methodically mapping the urban environment. They identified 17 sniper positions, determined the daily routines of civilian populations in each area, and developed a comprehensive plan for neutralizing threats with minimal risk to noncombatants. The operation required patience, precision, and psychological endurance that tested every member of Sarah's team. They would spend hours in concealed positions, watching, waiting for the perfect moment when they could take clean shots without endangering innocent people. Private Rodriguez struggled with the waiting. Sergeant, we could end this in one day with airstrikes. Why are we making it so complicated? Sarah looked at the young soldier, remembering her own early certainty about simple solutions to complex problems. Rodriguez, look through your scope at that building, she said, pointing to a structure where they had identified a sniper position. Tell me what you see. Rodriguez adjusted his optic and studied the building carefully. Hostile position, 3rd floor, eastern window. What else? Rodriguez looked again, more carefully this time. There are children playing in the courtyard. A woman hanging laundry. An old man sitting in the shade. Exactly, Sarah said. Airstrikes would eliminate the threat, but they would also eliminate everyone else in that building. Our job is to solve the problem without creating new ones. But it's so much more dangerous for us, Rodriguez protested. We're risking American lives to protect enemy civilians. Sarah turned to face him directly. They're not enemy civilians, Rodriguez. They're just civilians. People who happen to live in a place where bad people are doing bad things. Our job is to stop the bad people without hurting the innocent ones, even if it means more risk for us. Especially then, Sarah replied. That's what separates us from the insurgents. They don't care about civilian casualties. We do. That moral difference is what makes us worth defending. The conversation was interrupted by movement in the target building. Through her scope, Sarah could see an insurgent sniper preparing to engage a coalition patrol several blocks away. The civilian population in the courtyard had cleared out for their midday meal, creating a narrow window for engagement. Contact, Sarah called softly. Hostile sniper, 3rd floor, eastern window. Civilians clear. Taking the shot. The rifle's report echoed through the urban canyon. Through her scope, Sarah watched the threat disappear. The coalition patrol continued their movement, unaware that they had just been saved by precise fire from an overwatch position they couldn't even see. Clean shot, Rodriguez observed, impressed despite himself. The only kind we take, Sarah replied. Over the following days, Sarah's team systematically eliminated sniper threats throughout the district. Each engagement required hours of observation, careful timing, and precise execution. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but it was effective. By the end of the 2nd week, they had neutralized 12 of the 17 identified positions without a single civilian casualty. Local leaders began providing intelligence about remaining insurgent positions, impressed by the coalition's careful approach to clearing operations. But the operation's success created new challenges. Sarah's reputation for precision and ethical conduct made her the go-to leader for increasingly sensitive missions. Command began assigning her tasks that other units had failed to complete successfully. The most difficult assignment came during her 4th month in country. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, an insurgent leader responsible for coordinating attacks throughout the region. The target was hiding in a compound surrounded by civilian buildings, protected by heavily armed guards, and reportedly using children as human shields. Previous attempts to capture or eliminate the target had failed because of the complex civilian situation. Sarah's team was tasked with developing a new approach. This is different, Sarah told her team during mission planning. The target knows we're coming. He's prepared for conventional tactics. We need to think differently. Sarah spent days studying the target compound, analyzing patterns of movement, identifying vulnerabilities in the defensive setup. What she discovered was both troubling and tactically useful. The target was indeed using civilian families as protection, Those families were being held against their will. He's not just hiding behind civilians, Sarah explained to her team. He's holding hostages. That changes everything. The mission evolved from a simple elimination task to a complex hostage rescue operation. Sarah's team would have to neutralize guards, extract innocent civilians, and either capture or eliminate the high-value target, all while avoiding casualties among the very people they were trying to protect. Sarah proposed a coordinated approach. Her team would establish overwatch positions around the compound, eliminate external guards with precision fire, then guide special operations forces through the compound to extract hostages and capture the target. Too complicated, Major Harrison argued during the briefing. Too many moving parts. Too many opportunities for things to go wrong. Sir, the simple approaches have failed repeatedly, Sarah replied. This target has survived because he knows how conventional forces operate. We need to do something he won't expect. And if your plan fails? Sarah met his gaze directly. Then we'll adapt and overcome, just like we always do. But we won't fail because we were afraid to try something difficult. The major studied her for a long moment. Sarah's track record of successful operations gave her credibility that few junior non-commissioned officers possessed. Approved, he said finally. But if this goes wrong, it's on you. The operation began at dawn. Sarah's team moved into position under cover of darkness, establishing overwatch points that provided clear fields of fire on the compound's external defenses. Through her scope, Sarah could see the human cost of the insurgent leader's tactics. Women and children confined to specific areas of the compound, clearly against their will. The sight filled her with cold anger. Sarah had accepted the moral complexity of war, had learned to live with the necessity of taking lives in defense of her fellow soldiers and innocent people. But the deliberate use of children as human shields crossed a line that made her decision-making much simpler. All positions, report status, Sarah called through her radio. One by one, her team confirmed they were in position with clear shots on assigned targets. The special operations team was standing by for their assault phase. Execute, Sarah commanded. For shots fired simultaneously. For guards dropped instantly. The special operations team moved through the breach Sarah's team had created, beginning the delicate process of separating hostages from their captors. What followed was the most intense 20 minutes of Sarah's military career. Through her scope, she provided overwatch for the assault team, eliminating threats as they emerged while carefully avoiding any shots that might endanger the hostages they were trying to rescue. The insurgent leader attempted to escape through a hidden tunnel, emerging near Sarah's position with a young girl held as a human shield. Through her scope, Sarah could see the terror in the child's eyes, could see the insurgent's finger on the trigger of a pistol pressed against the girl's head. For several seconds, Sarah had no shot. The target was using the child's body to shield himself completely. Any attempt to engage would risk hitting the hostage. But then, the insurgent made a mistake. He shifted position slightly, exposing enough of his shoulder for Sarah to attempt a precision shot. It would be the most difficult shot of her career, a target area the size of a playing card, with an innocent child's life hanging in the balance. Sarah controlled her breathing, calculated the wind effect, adjusted for the slight downward angle, and slowly applied pressure to the trigger. The shot had to be perfect. The rifle fired. Through her scope, Sarah watched the insurgent leader collapse. The child ran toward coalition forces, unharmed but terrified. Target down, Sarah reported. Hostage safe. The operation concluded with the successful extraction of 14 civilian hostages and the elimination of a high-value target who had been responsible for numerous attacks on coalition and civilian targets. No friendly forces were wounded. No hostages were harmed. In the after-action review, Sarah's commanding officers praised the operation as a textbook example of precision application of force. But Sarah felt no satisfaction from the praise. She was thinking about the child who had been used as a human shield, about the psychological trauma that would follow that little girl for the rest of her life. Outstanding work, Sergeant Chun, Colonel Patterson said during the formal debriefing. Your team's performance was exemplary. Thank you, sir, Sarah replied. But I keep thinking about that little girl. About what she experienced today. You saved her life, the colonel pointed out. I know, sir. But I also put her in a position where she had to watch someone die violently right next to her. That's going to affect her forever. The colonel was quiet for a moment. You understand that sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. Yes, sir. I understand that completely. But understanding it doesn't make it easier to live with. That conversation marked another evolution in Sarah's thinking about war and her role in it. She had moved beyond the simple moral questions that had troubled her during early deployments. Now she was grappling with the complex reality that sometimes doing the right thing still caused harm to innocent people. Her team noticed the change in her demeanor after the hostage rescue operation. She became more introspective, more careful in her decision-making, more focused on long-term consequences rather than immediate tactical success. Sergeant, Private Rodriguez approached her one evening as she cleaned her rifle. "Are you okay? You seem different since the compound operation." Sarah looked up at the young soldier who had learned so much over the past few months. "Rodriguez, do you know how many people I've killed in 3 deployments?" Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "No, Sergeant. I've never thought to count." "I have," Sarah said. "I count everyone. I remember every face I've seen through my scope. I think about their families, their dreams, their potential contributions to the world. Doesn't that make it harder to do the job?" Sarah considered the question carefully. Yes and no. It makes each decision harder, but it also makes each decision better. When you really understand the cost of taking a life, you become very careful about when and how you do it. "Do you regret any of them?" "All of them," Sarah replied immediately. "And none of them. I regret that circumstances forced those decisions. I regret that people died who might have lived different lives under different circumstances. But I don't regret the decisions themselves. Every shot I've taken was necessary to protect innocent lives." Rodriguez nodded slowly, processing the complexity of what his team leader was describing. "The hardest part," Sarah continued, "isn't the killing. It's carrying the weight of those decisions while continuing to make new ones. It's staying human while doing inhuman things for human reasons." As Sarah's 3rd deployment neared its end, her record of accomplishment was staggering. She had led 43 successful operations, eliminated 67 confirmed threats, and saved the lives of countless coalition forces and civilian noncombatants. More importantly, she had mentored young soldiers through their first experiences with moral complexity in combat situations. But the personal cost was mounting. Sarah's journal entries became longer, more philosophical, more focused on questions about the nature of violence and responsibility in warfare. Day 267, she wrote one evening. "Eliminated 3 insurgents today during a convoy ambush. Clean shots, immediate threat neutralization, no civilian casualties. Standard successful operation by military metrics. But I keep thinking about one of them. Couldn't have been more than 17 years old. What led him to that position? What different choices might have kept him alive? How many others will follow the same path because we failed to address root causes?" These were not the thoughts of a soldier becoming weak or hesitant. Sarah's tactical performance had never been better. Her decision-making remained sharp, her shooting remained precise, her leadership continued to earn respect from superiors and subordinates alike. But she was developing a perspective on war that went beyond tactical success to consider strategic implications and moral consequences in ways that few combat soldiers ever did. Her final operation of the deployment involved training local security forces in precision marksmanship and ethical engagement protocols. Sarah found herself teaching young soldiers from another culture the same lessons she had learned through painful experience: how to take life when necessary while preserving humanity and moral judgment. "The rifle is a tool," she explained to a class of local trainees. "But you are the weapon. Your mind, your judgment, your ability to see beyond the immediate situation. These are what determine whether you use that tool correctly." One of the trainees asked a question that hit close to home. "How do you carry the weight of so many deaths?" Sarah looked at the young soldier, seeing herself from 3 years earlier in his eager but uncertain expression. "You don't carry it," she replied. "You let it carry you. Let the weight of those lives make you more careful, more precise, more committed to getting it right. Honor the dead by making sure their deaths served a purpose worth their sacrifice." As Sarah prepared to return home, she realized that her evolution as a soldier was complete. She had become something unique in military service, a warrior who understood both the necessity and the cost of violence, someone who could apply lethal force with surgical precision while never losing sight of its human impact. The young woman who boarded the transport aircraft for home was not the same person who had enlisted 4 years earlier to pay for college. She had become someone comfortable with ultimate responsibility, someone who had learned to live with moral complexity, someone who understood that true strength came not from the ability to take life, but from the wisdom to know when such action was truly necessary. But Sarah didn't yet realize how her evolution would be viewed by military leadership. She didn't know that her unique combination of tactical excellence and moral sophistication had been noticed at the highest levels. She was about to discover that her journey was far from over, and that the most challenging test of her development as a soldier was still ahead of her. Sarah's homecoming after her third deployment was different from the previous ones. Instead of the expected leave period, she received orders to report to the Pentagon for a special assignment that would change the trajectory of her military career forever. The summons came through encrypted channels, signed by officers whose names Sarah recognized from news reports about military policy at the highest levels. She was to report for duty with the Strategic Studies Group, an elite think tank within the Department of Defense that advised senior leadership on emerging challenges and innovative solutions. "Why me?" Sarah asked Major Harrison during their final briefing before her departure. "I'm just a sergeant with a rifle." Harrison smiled at her characteristic understatement. "Chun, you're not just anything. You're a combat veteran with an unprecedented record of tactical success and moral leadership. You've developed approaches to complex combat situations that are being studied throughout the military." "I just did my job, sir." "Exactly," Harrison replied. "And the way you did that job has attracted attention from people who shape how we train soldiers and conduct operations. They want to understand how you think, how you make decisions under pressure." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention. She had never sought recognition for her service, had never thought of herself as exceptional. To her, she was simply a soldier who tried to do the right thing in difficult circumstances. The Pentagon was overwhelming for someone more accustomed to forward operating bases and battlefield conditions. The massive buildings seemed designed to dwarf individual humans, to remind visitors of the enormous scope of military power they were witnessing. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell met Sarah at the security checkpoint. He was younger than she had expected for someone in his position, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of intellectual intensity that suggested more time spent analyzing problems than shooting at them. "Sergeant Chun," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Colonel Mitchell. I'll be your supervisor while you're assigned to our unit." "Sir, can I ask what exactly I'll be doing here?" Mitchell gestured for her to follow him through corridors lined with portraits of military leaders spanning centuries of American warfare. "We study problems," he explained as they walked. "Specifically, we study problems that don't have obvious solutions. Situations where traditional military doctrine comes up short, where we need new approaches or innovative thinking." They stopped outside a conference room where Sarah could see several other officers studying documents and engaging in intense discussion. "Right now, we're working on developing new training protocols for urban combat operations," Mitchell continued. "How do we prepare soldiers for environments where enemy combatants deliberately hide among civilian populations? How do we maintain operational effectiveness while adhering to rules of engagement that prioritize civilian protection?" Sarah began to understand why she had been selected. "You want to know how we did it in the field?" "Partially, yes. But we also want your input on how to teach others to think the way you think. Your operational record suggests you've developed decision-making processes that allow for both tactical success and ethical conduct under extreme pressure." The assignment was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her military career. Instead of executing missions developed by others, she found herself helping to design training programs and operational concepts that would affect thousands of future soldiers. Her first project involved analyzing civilian casualty data from urban operations across multiple theaters of conflict. The statistics were sobering. Conventional approaches to clearing operations resulted in high rates of non-combatant deaths, which generated anti-coalition sentiment that made long-term peace more difficult to achieve. "Look at this pattern," Sarah pointed out during a briefing to senior officers. "Units that prioritize speed of operation tend to have higher civilian casualty rates. Units that prioritize precision tend to have lower casualty rates, but higher rates of friendly force casualties in the short term." General Patricia Adams, the senior officer overseeing the Strategic Studies Group, studied the data Sarah had compiled. "What's your assessment, Sergeant? Are we asking our soldiers to accept unacceptable risks to protect enemy civilians?" Sarah considered her response carefully. She was speaking to officers whose decisions would affect military policy at the highest levels. "General, I think we're asking the wrong question. The choice isn't between protecting our soldiers and protecting civilians. The choice is between short-term tactical gains and long-term strategic success." "Explain." Sarah moved to the map display, pointing to specific areas where her units had operated. "In this district, we spent 3 weeks carefully clearing sniper positions instead of using artillery strikes. It took longer and required more risk in the short term. But 6 months later, That district became the first to provide reliable intelligence about insurgent activities because local leaders trusted us to act responsibly. She pointed to another area on the map. In this area, a different unit used conventional clearing tactics. They eliminated the immediate threats quickly with minimal friendly casualties. But the civilian casualties they caused turned the entire population against coalition forces. We're still fighting in that area 2 years later. General Adams nodded thoughtfully. So you're arguing that moral considerations actually enhance tactical effectiveness? Not exactly, ma'am. I'm arguing that tactical and moral considerations aren't separate issues. They're part of the same strategic calculation. Dead civilians become insurgent recruits. Surviving civilians who trust us become intelligence sources. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Sarah describing specific operational examples and the decision-making processes that had led to successful outcomes. By the end of the session, she had helped senior officers understand that ethical conduct in combat wasn't just about moral principles. It was about practical effectiveness. Over the following months, Sarah found herself working on increasingly complex projects. She helped develop new training scenarios that force soldiers to consider long-term consequences of immediate tactical decisions. She consulted on rules of engagement that balanced force protection with civilian casualty prevention. Most importantly, she helped design psychological preparation programs for soldiers who would carry the moral weight of life and death decisions. Her work brought her into contact with military psychologists, ethics experts, and senior combat veterans from across the services. These conversations broadened her understanding of war and her own experiences within it. Dr. Elizabeth Torres, a military psychologist who had studied combat stress for 15 years, was particularly interested in Sarah's ability to function effectively despite the moral complexity of her role. Most soldiers deal with the psychological pressure of combat by compartmentalizing, Dr. Torres explained during one of their sessions. They separate their moral identity from their tactical identity. You seem to have integrated both. I don't understand the difference, Sarah replied. Compartmentalizing soldiers think, I'm a good person at home, but in combat I do whatever is necessary. Integrated soldiers like you think, I'm the same person in combat and at home, so I need to make decisions I can live with in both contexts. Doesn't everyone think that way? Dr. Torres shook her head. Actually, very few people can maintain moral consistency under extreme stress. Most human beings need psychological defense mechanisms to cope with violence. You've somehow managed to function without those defenses. Is that good or bad? It's unusual, Dr. Torres said. And it might be exactly what the military needs as warfare becomes more complex and politically sensitive. Sarah's work at the Pentagon was interrupted by a request that surprised everyone. The Secretary of Defense wanted to meet with her personally. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in the Secretary's private conference room, with only a handful of senior advisors present. Secretary Robert Williams was a former Marine general with combat experience spanning 3 decades. He had a reputation for directness and practical thinking that appealed to Sarah immediately. Sergeant Chun, he said after the formal introductions were complete, I've been reading your operational reports and your work with the Strategic Studies Group. I want to understand something about your approach to combat decision-making. What specifically, sir? You've been in situations where you could have achieved tactical objectives more quickly by accepting higher civilian casualties. You chose more difficult approaches that preserved non-combatant lives. Help me understand that thinking. Sarah had answered similar questions dozens of times over the past few months, but this felt different. This was the civilian leader responsible for military policy at the highest level. Mr. Secretary, every tactical decision has strategic implications. When we kill civilians, even accidentally, we create more enemies than we eliminate. When we protect civilians, even at some cost to ourselves, we create allies and intelligence sources. But you personally accept greater risk to avoid civilian casualties? Yes, sir. Why? Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain motivations that she had never fully articulated even to herself. Sir, I joined the military to protect people. If I start seeing civilian casualties as acceptable costs of protecting American lives, then I've become someone who values American lives more than other lives. That's not who I want to be. Even if those other lives belong to people whose countrymen are trying to kill American soldiers? Especially then, sir. Anyone can protect people who are on their side. Real moral courage is protecting people who aren't. The secretary studied her for a long moment. You understand that perspective might be seen as naive or idealistic? Yes, sir. But In my experience, it's also more effective at achieving mission objectives. How so? Sarah moved to the map display in the conference room, pointing to areas where she had operated. In every location where we prioritized civilian protection, local populations eventually began providing intelligence about enemy activities. In areas where other units prioritized speed over precision, we're still fighting the same battles years later. The secretary nodded slowly. So you're telling me that moral behavior is also practical behavior? In the long term, yes, sir. What's right and what works tend to be the same thing. The meeting continued for another hour, with Sarah describing specific operational examples and the decision-making frameworks she had developed through experience. By the end of the conversation, she had provided senior leadership with insights that would influence military doctrine for years to come. But Sarah didn't realize how significantly that meeting would change her own future. 2 weeks later, she received new orders that would take her to an assignment unlike anything in her military career. She was being promoted to staff sergeant and assigned to the military academy at West Point as an instructor in military ethics and tactical decision-making. Her job would be to teach future officers how to integrate moral considerations with tactical effectiveness. It's unprecedented, Colonel Mitchell told her during their final meeting at the Pentagon. Enlisted personnel don't typically serve as instructors at service academies. But your combination of combat experience and ethical thinking is exactly what we need to prepare the next generation of military leaders. Sarah felt the weight of the responsibility. She would be teaching officers who would one day lead soldiers in combat situations similar to those she had experienced. The lessons she shared could affect thousands of future decisions about life and death. Sir, I'm honored by the assignment, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach ethics to future officers. Chun, you're not teaching abstract philosophical concepts, Mitchell replied. You're teaching practical decision-making skills based on real-world experience. You're teaching them how to be effective leaders who can maintain moral clarity under pressure. The assignment at West Point would represent the culmination of Sarah's evolution from uncertain recruit to combat veteran to military philosopher. But she had no idea that her most significant test was still ahead of her. Before reporting to West Point, Sarah was scheduled for one final meeting at the Pentagon. She would be debriefed by a panel of senior officers who wanted to document her experiences and insights for future military education purposes. The panel was led by Admiral Richardson, a career naval officer who had served as both a combat commander and a military strategist. His questions would focus on the practical application of ethical principles in tactical situations. But Sarah didn't know that Admiral Richardson had been specifically chosen for this interview because of his reputation for asking difficult questions that revealed the true character of the soldiers he interviewed. The Admiral had one particular question in mind, a question that would force Sarah to confront the statistical reality of her combat record in a way that would challenge everything she believed about herself and her service. As Sarah prepared for what she thought would be a routine final interview, she had no idea that Admiral Richardson's question would produce an answer that would shock everyone in the room and change how the military understood the psychology of its most effective warriors. The stage was set for the moment that had brought Sarah's story full circle, the moment when her evolution as a soldier and a human being would be tested by a simple question about numbers that revealed truths no one had expected to discover.